Soul, released direct to streaming in the terrible 20s when most theaters were closed. As a consequence, the 3D version was shelved. However, today, the 3D version is finally getting a theatrical release. So depending on where you live, you might be able to finally get a look at this version of the movie. Apple is also releasing some 3D titles on their streaming service in February to promote their new goggles. The rumor at the moment is this will include many of Disney's previously unreleased 3D titles. Now, this is a movie centered around jazz. Jazz today is largely thought of as being perhaps just a step below classical music, appealing to the cultured and curious. It's prestigious, sophisticated, and niche as hell. But back in its day, it was what rock and roll was in the 60s, metal in the 80s, and EDM in the 90s, using the same instruments as the pop music of the day, but not to impress. It wanted to overwhelm and be played as loud and as tensely as possible. It was the soundtrack to Jack Kerouac's On the Road because it was for the young and drunk. Rude and vulgar, it was the sound of freedom for its time. And what is freedom? The mystic Rudolf Steiner liked to define it as a feeling. The feeling we get when we do exactly what we want to do. And I think that definition suits this particular movie very well. And here enters the 3D aspect. When we see the main character, Joe, get lost at the piano watching this flat, it does communicate the point of a state of mind. It makes sense, but add in the stereo, and wow, I really began to feel the moment. The 3D highlights the sense of flying off into that mystical mental ocean surrounded by a dancing space as he gets lost in what he's doing. Being able to experience emptiness, I notice, is something of an ironic luxury. Very few people can afford real space. Clutter is just sort of part of being a bit poor. There's never enough room. So becoming immersed in a movie that is largely set in a big open space has a way of feeling rich. And again, when you see this flat, it's sort of understood but not felt. The afterlife is very sparse, not much to see but the space. And here we find ethereal characters that are drawn as two-dimensional line art against the CGI background. The fact that they are flat makes far less of an impression if you are not watching this in 3D. Abstract 2D characters is common. We see it on YouTube all the time. But when seen in the context of a stereo world, they begin to make some subconscious sense. They begin to feel not as being from a flat world, but from a higher dimension that is looking in on this one, like shadows of something that cannot be seen. Again, all this can be understood by watching the movie flat, but the 3D seems to complete the circuit, moving the view from understanding to actually experiencing. Now, this is not a flashy experience. There are no fireworks, no in-your-face moments, but it takes you to a place. It's not a roller coaster, but it's still a ride. The city is often jaw-dropping in the amount of detail Pixar poured into the city shots. Here's a rare moment where they let the 3D go deep and show the street stretch off into the horizon. Look at all the stuff to see. Flat, your eyes might just sort of roll over it all and take it in like a fine painted canvas. But in 3D, I found my eyes going from pole to pole and street sign to street sign, searching deeper into the picture. There's also a fascinating array of reflections to be seen. Mirror shots are always fun in 3D, and here there seems to be an abundance of them. I wonder if it was meant to symbolize the self-reflection themes of the movie. There are also many moments of really less obvious reflection. Check out this blink and you'll miss it moment on the side of the bus. Also, there's this elevator shot where the interior had a dull reflection that can be missed, but when noticed, it really expanded the moment, making the elevator feel like it was actually something of, well, let's say a portal. Perhaps it symbolizes that Joe is forever surrounded by a much larger world that can only be barely perceived. Speaking of portals, one of my favorite things to see in 3D is doorways to another dimension, and we get them frequently here. And they tended to have considerable depth to them as well, making the other side really look like an adventure. Seen flat, this moment in particular just looks like a picture popped up. It was not very interesting, but in 3D, it adds so much depth. It emphasizes the interaction of these line art characters with the third dimension. And the scene just becomes an experience instead of mere communication. And it's fun. Similar to portals, there's nothing like a nice smudged up window in stereo. And here's another great but not flashy moment showing the streetlights outside. It brings to life the idea of having a little solace in a restaurant while the world rushes by outside. Now, I couldn't let this review go without mentioning this nice little cityscape shot that we get. It has been given just a touch of hyperstereo to let the buildings stand out. Not fast, not flashy, just a couple of nice postcard moments. And story-wise, what can you not say about this movie? Soul is one of those movies where the story is almost secondary to the potential meanings. Joe, the musical teacher with big dreams, and 22, the unborn soul. The way I see it, Joe and this 22 character are actually the same person. I see 22 as future Joe, once it really sinks in that Joe's musical dreams are dash. There's a proverb that goes, when there's no purpose, people are unrestrained. And that's 22, without purpose and certainly unrestrained, bouncing from indulgent to eventually self-loathing. Purpose is such a funny thing. There's a motivational guy who tells about a drill sergeant taking a group on an exhausting run. Although long and agonizing, the group's mood gained strength as they approached a perceived finish line, but the sergeant kept running right past it, and their collective hearts sank into their boots. You see, they imagined a purpose in the form of a line and lived on the hope of it, but when it passed by, their outlook died, and they had to grow a new attitude towards things. I find this is Joe, who imagines there's a line out there that he's meant to cross. And you might also say this type of purpose death theme makes Soul a reincarnation story, which doesn't happen when we die, but again and again while we live. Our outlooks die and grow again, born again with new purpose. Another video I recently came across said that the very old, when asked what age they would return to if they could, would not typically choose their youth, but rather say their mid-30s, because that is when most of them felt when they were the most useful and in demand to other people. I would guess if you actually visited these people when they were in their 30s and asked them what their purpose was, you'd get no clear answer. Articulating your own purpose is like nailing Jell-O to the wall. You might say something like career, family, or passion, but generally anything you could come up with will be transient and circumstantial. And you kind of wonder why then give purpose such importance. And it seems purpose is not something we can ever really possess. We may participate in a purpose, but we don't own it any more than we do the air in our lungs. It is used, it is discarded, we move on, and often it can be missed like an old friend, but if we hold on to it, it has a way of spoiling and stinking up the room. I think also that one of the secret ingredients that makes this movie work so well is Joe is shown as connected to young and old alike. The very old are actually a backbone of society in a multitude of ways. I don't mean wisdom, volunteering, or neighborhood watchdogs, just by existing, which may be our only true purpose. Every socialist movement tries to belittle, isolate, or even eliminate the old, and the textbooks will tell you it is done as an attempt to control education. Perhaps, but I think there's kind of a polarity to society, like a bulb wired to two sides of a battery, that we need interactions from the young all the way to the old to complete a circuit, a kind of spiritual battery. And disrupting that, regardless of the philosophy, will naturally break people. And when Joe decides to follow his bliss or be free, it, in a sense, unplugs him from his circuit. And when the bliss was over, he was not recharged. He passed his perceived finish line and realized the run continues. Purpose may be what we do with energy, but it is not the source of our energy. Keep your soul wired.
Joey! Oh,
so
baby boy,
proud
we
of
heard
you.
the news.
Oh crap, she knows.
Your mama's in the
22!
Leave me alone! I'm trying to find my purpose!
22, you come back here! 22!
Body's in a holding pattern. It's complicated. I'll get you back to your group.
Woo.